Have you ever locked eyes with a stranger and felt something collapse inside you? Not fear, not attraction, but recognition? Not the polite recognition of a familiar face, but a deeper, quieter certainty, a feeling that arrives before thought. As if your body whispered, "I know this person," even while your mind insists you don't. What if that moment wasn't imagination? What if it wasn't coincidence? What if, for a fraction of a second, you were standing in front of another version of yourself? We are taught to trust memory as proof of reality. If you don't remember someone, then you've never met them. If you've never met them, then what you feel must be error, projection, fantasy, a trick of pattern-hungry neurons. But the human brain is not only a recorder of the past, it is also a censor, a gatekeeper, a survival machine that edits reality to preserve coherence. And sometimes, it hides things not because they are false, but because they are too destabilizing to hold. Think about how recognition normally works. You see a face, your brain scans stored images, emotional associations, names, places. Recognition arrives with context. But these encounters feel different. There is no memory file to open, no name, no scene, just resonance. Like hearing a note that matches a frequency already vibrating inside you. Why would a stranger feel familiar in a way that bypasses memory entirely? Across cultures, across time, people have described this sensation using different languages but the same emotion, a shock of sameness, a mirror that breathes, someone who finishes your sentences not because they predict you, but because they are you, slightly rearranged. Science calls this coincidence. Psychology calls it projection. Philosophy calls it the self encountering itself. But none of these explanations fully explain the weight of the moment, the way time seems to thin, the way your awareness sharpens, the way something inside you pauses, as if listening. Modern physics tells us that reality is not singular. At the most fundamental level, the universe does not choose just one outcome. It explores all of them. Every decision, every quantum fluctuation, every fork in probability creates divergence. Not metaphorically, mathematically. The equations don't collapse into one story. They branch. And if reality itself branches, then consciousness, whatever it truly is, may not be confined to a single thread. Imagine your life not as a straight line, but as a river delta. Every choice splits the flow. In one branch, you turned left. In another, you turned right. In one, you spoke. In another, you stayed silent. These versions of you are not imaginary. They are logical consequences of a universe that does not discard possibilities, but preserves them. The unsettling question is not whether these versions exist. It's whether they are completely separate, or only mostly. Because separation in physics is never absolute. Systems that once interacted remain subtly correlated, even across distance, even across time. Entanglement does not care about intuition. Once two things share a state, they carry echoes of each other forever. If consciousness is a process rather than an object, if it is something that emerges rather than something that sits in the skull, then it may carry echoes too. Not memories, not images, but feelings, intuitions. Recognition without narrative. This could explain why some encounters feel scripted, as if the dialogue has already been rehearsed somewhere you can't access. Why certain people feel instantly legible, like reading your own handwriting in a stranger's notebook. Why there are moments when conversation feels less like exchange and more like alignment, two streams briefly flowing parallel. And here's the unsettling part. These encounters are rarely neutral. They feel charged, magnetic, sometimes comforting, sometimes deeply disturbing. Because when you meet someone who mirrors you too closely, the illusion of being singular begins to crack. You are forced to confront a possibility the ego resists with everything it has, that you are not a unique accident drifting alone through time, but one expression of a larger pattern unfolding across multiple realities. Your brain is designed to protect you from that thought. Identity depends on boundaries. The sense of I requires separation from not I. If those boundaries weaken, even briefly, anxiety follows. Dissociation. A sense of unreality. That's why the mind rushes to rationalize these moments. Coincidence, chemistry, familiar archetypes, anything to seal the crack. But the feeling often lingers, like a bruise you don't remember getting. Have you noticed how these encounters tend to happen during transitions? New cities, late nights, airports, train stations, periods of loss or reinvention, moments when your sense of self is already in motion. Physics tells us that systems are most sensitive at the edge of change. Small perturbations matter more when structure is unstable. Perhaps identity works the same way. When you are between versions of yourself, you are more likely to brush against another. There is a reason stories across history are filled with doubles, shadows, reflections, doppelgängers, not as villains, but as omens, as warnings, as messengers. They appear at moments of decision, moments of collapse, moments when a life is about to split. We tell ourselves these are metaphors, but metaphors often survive because they are approximations of something real that cannot be said directly. What if, on some level, you already know this? What if the unease you feel isn't fear of the unknown, but recognition of something half-remembered, a rule you once understood and then forgot, a truth that didn't disappear but went quiet, like background radiation, always present, rarely noticed? If multiple versions of you exist, then existence is not a solo performance. It is a chorus, staggered across probability. Most of the time, the voices don't overlap. They stay in their lanes. But under certain conditions, the distance between them narrows, and when it does, you feel it. Not as information, as intuition. As a sudden sense that the room is more crowded than it looks. This raises a darker possibility. If overlap is possible, then divergence is not absolute. If divergence is not absolute, then survival may not mean what we think it means. Near misses, accidents avoided by seconds, decisions that should have ended everything but didn't. What if those moments weren't escapes, but transfers? Not of bodies, but of continuity. A subtle slide into the branch where you continue. If that were true, then meeting another version of yourself wouldn't be rare. It would be inevitable. The only mystery would be why you don't notice it more often. And the answer may be simple and terrifying. You are not meant to. Because noticing would destabilize the story, and the story is how you function. The story is how you wake up, make choices, love people, plan futures. Without it, meaning fractures. So the mind edits. It smooths, it erases the sharp edges. But it can't erase everything. Some things leak through, in glances held too long, in conversations that feel preloaded, in the strange grief you feel when a stranger walks away, and you don't know why it hurts. This documentary is not here to convince you of a theory. It is here to reopen a question you may have closed too quickly. To explore whether these moments of recognition are noise or signal, whether identity is a sealed container or a permeable field, whether the self is singular or plural, pretending to be one. If you have ever felt watched by your own thoughts, guided by instincts you didn't learn, pulled toward lives you never lived, then this is not abstract. It is personal. And as we move forward, the question will become harder to ignore. Not whether you have other versions, but whether you have already met them. Have you ever felt it happen in the middle of an ordinary moment? Not during danger, not during drama, but while standing in line, crossing a street, listening to someone speak. A sudden, silent certainty that this exact moment has already occurred. The words feel pre-spoken. The gestures feel rehearsed. Time doesn't stop, but it hesitates, like a breath held just a fraction too long. We call this déjà vu, and we are taught to dismiss it as a neurological hiccup. But what if that explanation is not the full story? What if déjà vu is not a mistake in the brain, but a residue left behind by something that has already passed through? Think carefully about the texture of déjà vu. It is not memory. Memory carries images, context, sequence. Déjà vu carries none of that. It is familiarity without content, recognition without recall. As if the mind is saying, this has happened, while refusing to say when or how. That contradiction is important, because the brain is excellent at fabricating false memories, but it is terrible at producing pure familiarity without detail, unless something has interfered with the normal recording process. In neuroscience, memory is not stored as a single object. It is distributed, layered, reconstructed each time you access it, which means memory is not a vault. It is an ongoing negotiation. And negotiations leave traces. If a memory is partially formed, partially erased, or partially overwritten, the result is not amnesia. It is a ghost, a sensation without a story. Déjà vu feels exactly like that, a footprint without a visible body. Now, consider this possibility. What if the memory you are sensing does not belong to this version of your life? What if it was formed somewhere else, under slightly different conditions, and only fragments of it remain accessible? Not as images, but as familiarity. Not as knowledge, but as certainty. A certainty that makes no sense, yet refuses to leave. Physics gives us an unsettling framework for this idea. In a branching universe, events do not simply happen once. They happen across multiple outcomes. Most of these outcomes never interact again. But never in physics is a strong word. It assumes perfect isolation, and perfect isolation rarely exists. Even separate quantum systems can influence each other if they share a history, if they were once part of the same wave of possibility. Your life, at every moment, is such a wave. Before a choice is made, multiple futures coexist. After the choice, they separate. But separation does not require annihilation. It requires distance. And distance, even across realities, does not always erase correlation. Déjà vu may be the moment when correlation briefly becomes perceptible. This would explain why déjà vu is more likely during mundane moments than dramatic ones. Drama demands attention. The brain tightens its grip on narrative. Mundane moments loosen it. They create cognitive slack. Space where subtle signals can slip through. You are not guarding your identity as closely when you are bored, distracted, or relaxed. And in those moments, something brushes past. Notice also how déjà vu is often accompanied by a strange emotional neutrality. Not joy, not fear, just a quiet intensity. Like standing near machinery you can't see, but can feel vibrating through the floor. That emotional flatness suggests the experience is not generated by the limbic system, the brain's emotional engine, but by something deeper and more structural, something that recognizes alignment, not meaning. And then there is the timing. Déjà vu often clusters around periods of transition: adolescence, loss, relocation, reinvention, times when identity is already in flux, when the narrative of who you are is being edited. During these periods, the boundary between versions of yourself is thinner because you are already letting one version die to make room for another. The mind is more permeable then, more tolerant of overlap. What if, during these transitions, you are closer to the branching point, closer to the moment where other versions of you are also recalibrating, and what you feel is not the past repeating, but parallel lives momentarily syncing, not long enough to exchange memories, long enough to exchange resonance. This reframes déjà vu as a kind of interference pattern. When two waves overlap, they do not merge. They create regions of intensity, peaks and troughs, brightness and shadow. If consciousness behaves like a wave, then moments of overlap would not produce clear images. They would produce sensations, familiarity, a sense of rightness or wrongness without explanation. It would also explain why trying to analyze déjà vu often makes it disappear. Observation collapses delicate systems. Attention introduces noise. The more you try to pin the feeling down, the faster it dissolves. Like trying to stare directly at a reflection in dark glass, it vanishes the moment you focus too hard. But there is another, darker implication. If déjà vu is a footprint, then something has already walked this path. If a moment feels rehearsed, then it may have been lived, just not by this you. And if that is true, then the sense of inevitability people sometimes feel during déjà vu is not illusion. It is memory leaking across versions, a hint of what usually happens when this configuration of events occurs. This could explain the subtle anxiety that sometimes follows. Not fear of danger, but unease, as if you are moving toward an outcome you vaguely recognize but cannot describe. The feeling fades, but it leaves a residue, a sense that choice is narrower than it appears, that freedom is real, but not infinite. And yet, the feeling does not always warn. Sometimes, it comforts. Sometimes, it feels like confirmation, as if another version of you has been here and survived, as if the path you are on is not unique, but well-worn, that someone else, another you, has already navigated this terrain. Why would the mind allow such a sensation at all? If it is destabilizing, why not erase it completely? Because total erasure is costly. The brain is efficient, not perfect. It prioritizes survival, not metaphysical clarity. If the cost of removing every trace of overlap is higher than the cost of tolerating occasional confusion, the system chooses confusion, especially if the confusion is fleeting and rarely acted upon. There may also be a deeper reason. Recognition, even when confusing, can be grounding. It can stabilize behavior. If you feel a moment is familiar, you may behave more cautiously, more attentively, as if guided by an intuition you don't understand. In that sense, déjà vu could be adaptive, a faint signal from other outcomes, nudging you away from catastrophic paths and towards survivable ones. This is not destiny. It is probability management, a subtle form of guidance emerging from a multiverse that does not speak in words, but in feelings. If that sounds unsettling, it should, because it suggests that some of your intuitions are not born solely from experience or instinct. They may be echoes, feedback from lives adjacent to yours, lives that diverge just enough to leave a trace, but not enough to be completely silent. The question then becomes unavoidable. If déjà vu is a footprint, and footprints imply movement, then where are these paths leading? Are they converging? Are they repeating? Or are they warning signs, markers placed by versions of you who walked too far in one direction? As we move forward, we will begin to examine the people who seem to trigger these sensations most strongly, the ones who feel instantly familiar, the ones who unsettle you without doing anything wrong, the ones who feel like mirrors held at the wrong angle, because places can overlap, moments can overlap, but people are where overlap becomes impossible to ignore. And once you start noticing that pattern, it becomes much harder to believe you are alone inside your own life. The next segment will take us directly into that territory. Have you noticed that déjà vu rarely comes alone? That it often arrives carrying a face with it? Not a memory, not a name, but a person. Someone you meet for the first time, yet your nervous system reacts as if this meeting is overdue. Your posture adjusts, your voice shifts, your humor sinks. There is no effort involved, no social calculation. It feels less like introduction and more like recognition quietly resuming after a pause. These are not just familiar people. They are mirror people. They don't look like you. They don't live your life. But something underneath aligns too cleanly to ignore. The rhythm of their thinking, the timing of their pauses, the way their eyes move when processing a thought. Sometimes even their flaws feel familiar, like habits you once had or narrowly avoided developing. Being around them feels effortless and disturbing at the same time, because it bypasses the slow ritual of getting to know someone. It skips straight to resonance. Psychology would tell you this is projection, that you are seeing yourself because you are searching for yourself, that humans bond over similarity, and similarity creates comfort. But comfort is not what people usually report. They report intensity, a pull, sometimes even resistance, as if two magnets are either snapping together or pushing violently apart. Comfort doesn't usually come with unease. Recognition does. Across countless personal accounts, there is a strange consistency in how these mirror people appear. They often enter your life briefly, unexpectedly, at moments when you are questioning who you are or where you are going. They do not always stay. In fact, they often leave abruptly, without closure. And their absence leaves behind an outsized impact, as if something important was exchanged, though neither of you can say what. Why would a stranger matter this much? In physics, systems that share internal structure can synchronize without direct communication. Two oscillators placed near each other will eventually fall into rhythm. Pendulums mounted on the same wall begin to swing together, not because they choose to, but because shared constraints allow energy to transfer. The wall becomes the medium. The synchrony is emergent. What if consciousness works the same way? What if people who share deeper structural similarities, not just personality, but decision patterns, emotional thresholds, core fears, can resonate across different life paths? Not because they lived the same life, but because they could have. Because at some branching point, they were the same wave before splitting. A mirror person might not be a duplicate of you. They might be you, rotated slightly by circumstance. A version that made a different choice, endured a different loss, followed a different instinct. Close enough to feel identical in motion, distant enough to be unrecognizable in detail. This would explain why interactions with mirror people feel accelerated, why conversations skip small talk and land immediately on existential topics, why you feel seen without explaining yourself, and why being seen that clearly can feel threatening. Because to be mirrored is to be confronted with possibilities, with lives adjacent to yours, with evidence that who you are is not the only way you could have been. There is also a darker side to these encounters. Many people report that mirror people seem to carry traits they suppressed, risks they didn't take, vulnerabilities they buried, sometimes even failures they narrowly avoided. It's as if the universe is holding up a version of you and asking, quietly, this too was possible, not as punishment, as information. And information, when delivered without context, can destabilize identity. Your sense of self depends on continuity, on the belief that your past led cleanly to your present. Mirror people interrupt that story. They suggest that your life is one slice through a much larger structure, that your personality is not a singular artifact, but a cluster of tendencies that could be arranged differently and still produce a coherent human being. This is why mirror people often trigger strong emotional reactions that feel disproportionate: obsession, irritation, attachment, aversion. These are not responses to who they are, but to what they represent. A confrontation with the contingency of your own existence. You may notice another pattern. Mirror people often feel easy to predict, not because they are simple, but because their decision logic feels familiar. You can anticipate their reactions, their humor, their defensiveness. This creates a strange asymmetry. You feel close quickly, but intimacy doesn't necessarily deepen, because the mystery that usually fuels connection is missing. You are not discovering someone. You are recognizing a structure you already know. That can lead to rapid bonding, but also rapid exhaustion. Being around a mirror for too long can feel like staring at yourself without blinking. Eventually, one of you looks away. And then there are the moments of divergence, when you realize the mirror breaks, when they make a choice you wouldn't, when they cross a line you refuse to cross. These moments are often painful, disappointing, or clarifying, because they reveal the exact point where your paths split, the moment where one version of you became something the other did not. That realization can feel like grief, not for them, but for a self you never became. Why would reality allow such encounters at all? If branching lives exist, why not keep them fully isolated? Because isolation is not the default state of complex systems. Interaction is. Separation requires energy, maintenance, constant correction. And the more complex a system becomes, the harder perfect isolation is to sustain. Consciousness is one of the most complex systems we know. It is dynamic, adaptive, and deeply entangled with environment. Complete isolation between versions of consciousness may be theoretically neat, but practically unstable. Small overlaps may be inevitable, especially in places where probability density is high. Cities, crossroads, institutions, moments of collective transition. These are environments where many lives briefly align before diverging again. The more similar the internal structure of two people, the more likely they are to resonate when they pass through the same probabilistic corridor. This reframes coincidence as geometry, not chance, but alignment. It also reframes the feeling of being watched, or studied, or subtly compared during these encounters. Perhaps you are not being evaluated by the other person, but by yourself. A different self, noticing what you did with the same raw materials. This idea is unsettling because it implies continuity without identity, connection without communication. A network of selves that do not share memory but share origin, like branches of a tree that cannot see each other yet feel the same wind. And if that network exists, then mirror people are not anomalies, they are nodes, points where the structure briefly becomes visible. Once you start noticing them, you may realize you've met more than one, not all equally intense, not all equally clear. Some feel like faint reflections, others feel like full confrontations, and not all are meant to linger. Some are meant only to pass, leaving behind a disturbance in your narrative, a reminder that your life is not the only solution the universe explored. This brings us to a question that is impossible to ignore once it forms. If some versions of you exist close enough to be felt, then others must exist far enough to be lost. And if lives diverge far enough, what happens to the versions that fail? The ones that don't survive the branch? The ones that take the wrong step, miss the signal, arrive seconds too late? Because the story of mirror people is not only about recognition, it is also about survival. And in the next segment, we will move into that territory, where coincidence becomes escape, and escape begins to look disturbingly like substitution. Think back to the moments in your life that almost ended everything. Not the dramatic ones people talk about, but the quiet near misses, the car that braked a second earlier than expected, the illness that resolved without explanation, the decision to stay home instead of going out, later revealed to be the difference between safety and disaster. These moments often feel strangely muted in memory. You remember the facts, but not the fear, not fully, as if your emotional response arrived late, or belonged to someone else. We tell ourselves we were lucky. That probability favored us. That randomness smiled. But notice how unsatisfying that explanation feels when you sit with it too long. Luck explains survival, but it does not explain the aftertaste. The subtle sense that something shifted, that you continued, but not exactly as you were before, that the world feels the same, yet you do not quite occupy it in the same way. Across cultures, people who survive near-death events report a similar phenomenon, not always dramatic visions or spiritual awakenings, but something quieter and more persistent. A sense of detachment, a sense of having crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, as if life since that moment is slightly out of phase with the life that came before. They struggle to articulate it because language insists on continuity, and what they feel is discontinuity disguised as normality. Physics has a word for systems that survive transitions by shifting states rather than breaking. Phase change. Water becomes ice. Gas becomes liquid. The substance remains, but its internal structure reorganizes. The environment feels familiar, but interactions change. What if survival sometimes works the same way? Not by preserving a single trajectory, but by transferring continuity to a nearby one. Imagine reality not as a single path, but as a braided rope. Each strand is a possible life. When one strand frays, when an outcome becomes untenable, tension redistributes. The rope holds because there are other strands nearby. To an observer inside the rope, it feels like nothing broke. But internally, something shifted. This is where the idea becomes unsettling. If your consciousness is not strictly bound to one strand, then survival may not mean avoiding death. It may mean avoiding finality. Sliding unconsciously into the version of reality where you continue. The cost of that slide would not be physical. It would be informational. A loss of precise alignment, a slight mismatch between memory, emotion, and environment. That mismatch could explain why some survivors feel like imposters in their own lives, why familiar places feel subtly wrong, why relationships feel unchanged on the surface, but different in texture, why joy feels quieter and sorrow feels heavier, or vice versa. It's not trauma alone. Trauma sharpens memory. This feels more like a blur, a smoothing over. If this were true, then death would not always look like disappearance from the inside. It would look like persistence, like waking up and assuming nothing happened, like continuing the story because the story must continue somewhere. The version of you that didn't survive would not experience anything at all. No darkness, no ending, just absence. Continuity would belong exclusively to the branch where you remain. This reframes a terrifying idea often whispered but rarely examined. That subjectively, you always survive. That consciousness only experiences branches where it continues, not because you are immortal in the physical sense, but because experience itself cannot include its own termination. From the inside, there is always a next moment, until there isn't. And when there isn't, there is no one left to notice. If that idea unsettles you, notice where the discomfort arises. It's not fear of death, it's fear of isolation. Fear that survival is not shared. Fear that each version of you continues alone, unaware of the others that failed. Fear that meaning dissolves if endings are unevenly distributed. And yet, this framework also carries a strange implication. If consciousness follows the path of continued experience, then near-death events would cluster around branch points, places where outcomes are sharply divided. And the aftermath of those events would feel exactly as people describe, like something fundamental changed, without a clear reason why. It would also explain why some people feel they've lived more than one life without reincarnation, why they feel older than their years, why they carry grief without origin, why they feel responsible for something they can't name. These may not be emotions generated by this life alone, but echoes carried forward from branches that collapsed. This brings us back to mirror people. If you survive by shifting into a nearby branch, then other versions of you may have done the same, landing close, but not identical. The density of similar lives would increase around survivable paths, and occasionally those paths would intersect. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough for recognition to spark. A mirror person might not just be a version of you who chose differently. They might be a version who survived differently, one who carries scars you don't remember earning, one whose caution or recklessness feels familiar because it once belonged to you elsewhere. This could explain why some mirror people feel wounded in ways that resonate too deeply, why you feel compelled to protect them or distance yourself from them, why their presence stirs guilt you can't justify. It may not be empathy alone. It may be identification across outcomes. Notice how rarely people talk about the ethics of survival. We celebrate it. We romanticize it. But if survival is not singular, if it involves substitution rather than preservation, then it carries a quiet moral weight. Not blame, not guilt, but responsibility. The responsibility of being the version that continues. That responsibility often manifests as a vague sense of purpose, not ambition, not destiny, but a feeling that you are meant to do something without knowing what. A sense that time is borrowed, not owned. That your presence here is conditional. If you've ever felt that pressure without understanding its source, consider this possibility. You are not haunted by death. You are accompanied by the absence of versions that didn't make it. Not as ghosts, as silence. And silence can be heavy. This perspective does not require belief. It requires only attention. Attention to the moments that feel misaligned, to the people who feel like echoes, to the survivals that feel less like victories and more like transitions. Because once you accept that continuity might be fluid, the question shifts. It's no longer, why did I survive? It becomes, what am I carrying forward? And that question leads us directly into the most unsettling territory of all. Not survival across timelines, but influence. What happens when versions of you don't just coexist, but begin to affect each other? That is where we go next. Have you ever noticed how some encounters don't just affect your mood, but seem to rewrite you? Not dramatically, not overnight, but subtly, persistently. You leave a conversation and days later realize your thinking has shifted. Your habits adjust. Your fears rearrange themselves. You can't trace the change to any advice given or argument won. It feels less like learning, and more like alignment, as if something inside you tuned itself to a new frequency. This is where the idea of parallel lives becomes most disturbing, because coexistence is one thing, influence is another. If other versions of you exist close enough to be felt, then the boundary between them may not be impermeable. Physics already tells us that boundaries are conveniences, not absolutes. Fields pass through walls. Forces act across emptiness. Information leaks in ways that matter cannot. If consciousness is not a static object, but a dynamic process, a pattern sustained over time, then it may be vulnerable to the same kinds of leakage. Think about how influence works between ordinary people. Emotions synchronize in groups. Moods spread without words. Anxiety can infect a room. Calm can settle it. This is not mystical. It's biological. Nervous systems are social instruments. They evolve to couple, to resonate, to adjust. Now, imagine two nervous systems that are not just socially compatible, but structurally similar at a deep level. Similar thresholds for fear, similar reward loops, similar internal narratives. If such systems were brought into proximity, even briefly, the coupling would be stronger, faster, more complete. Mirror people feel like this. Being around them doesn't feel like being persuaded. It feels like being reminded, as if dormant traits are reactivated, as if unused pathways light up again. You may notice yourself adopting their expressions, their cadence, their way of framing problems, without conscious imitation. And when the encounter ends, those changes don't always revert. This suggests a possibility that is difficult to sit with. That influence is not always horizontal between different people. Sometimes it may be vertical between different versions of the same person. If branching lives exist, then each version of you is exploring a different configuration of traits, different balances of risk and caution, attachment and detachment, hope and resignation. Most of these configurations remain isolated, but when two versions come close enough, through resonance, environment, or coincidence, the system may attempt to synchronize. not fully, but partially, enough to exchange tendencies. This would not look like possession or memory transfer. It would look like preference drift, personality nudging, a sudden interest in something you never cared about, a sudden aversion to something you once loved, the kind of change that feels internally motivated but whose origin you cannot locate. People often describe this after intense but brief connections. I don't know why, but after meeting them, I couldn't go back to being who I was. We romanticize this as love or inspiration. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it feels less chosen, less poetic, more like contamination or correction. Why would such influence occur? Because complex systems optimize. When similar systems interact, they tend to reduce internal conflict by aligning their states. In physics, this minimizes energy. In biology, it increases stability. In consciousness, it may increase survivability. If one version of you has adapted better to certain conditions, its traits may be more stable. When another version encounters it, synchronization may subtly favor those stable traits. This reframes influence not as domination, but as convergence toward viable patterns. And that has implications that are both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it suggests you are not entirely alone in navigating existence, that other versions of you may have already explored paths you are approaching, and their adaptations can guide you. Terrifying because it suggests your sense of authorship over your own personality is weaker than you think. You may not be building yourself from scratch. You may be inheriting updates. This could explain why certain changes feel irreversible. Why, after some encounters, returning to your old self feels impossible. Not undesirable, impossible. As if the previous configuration no longer compiles. As if your internal software rejected a rollback. It could also explain why some encounters feel dangerous. Why you feel the need to pull away from certain people without being able to articulate why. Not because they are harmful, but because they are too influential, too aligned, and too capable of pulling you into a configuration you are not ready or willing to inhabit. This is not superstition. It is pattern recognition applied to identity. If identity is a dynamic equilibrium, then proximity to similar equilibria can destabilize it, especially if one configuration is more coherent, more decisive, more resolved. You may feel drawn to it because it promises relief from internal conflict, or repelled because adopting it would require letting go of something you are not ready to lose. There is also a darker implication. Influence does not have to be mutual. If one version of you is more stable, more integrated, it may influence others more than it is influenced in return. This introduces an asymmetry across versions, a hierarchy of coherence. Some lives may become attractors, patterns that other lives drift toward. If that is true, then some of the people you meet who feel eerily familiar may not just be mirrors, they may be anchors. Versions of you that have settled into a configuration your current life is gravitating toward. Their presence feels heavy because it compresses possibilities. It makes some futures feel more likely, and others quietly recede. This could explain why encounters with mirror people often coincide with major life shifts, career changes, relationship endings, sudden clarity, or sudden collapse. It's not that they cause these changes directly. It's that they destabilize the existing equilibrium, making latent trajectories unavoidable. You might resist this idea because it threatens the narrative of free will. But notice something important. Even if influence exists across versions, choice does not disappear. It becomes contextual. You still choose, but from a field shaped by interactions you do not fully perceive. That is already true within a single life. Genetics, culture, trauma, chance, all shape the menu of choices available. Cross-version influence would simply extend that field beyond the boundaries we assumed. The real fear, then, is not loss of control. It is loss of uniqueness. The idea that who you are is not an isolated miracle, but a consensus emerging across many attempts. That your values, fears, and desires are not purely personal, but statistically reinforced. That individuality is not erased, but softened. And yet, consider the alternative. A universe where every version of you is completely isolated. No feedback. No convergence. No learning across attempts. That universe would be inefficient, wasteful, cruel. It would allow the same mistakes to be made endlessly, without correction. Influence, then, may be the mechanism by which existence learns. Not at the level of species alone, but at the level of self. This does not mean you are being controlled by unseen versions of yourself. It means you are part of a distributed process, a network of lives exploring possibility space, occasionally brushing against each other, sharing what works, abandoning what doesn't. But this raises a final, deeply unsettling question. If influence flows across versions, then memory might too. Not as clear recollection, but as fragments, instincts, false memories, feelings of certainty that arrive without justification. And if that is true, then some of what you remember may not have happened to this version of you at all. Have you ever been absolutely certain about something that never happened? Not a vague suspicion, but a firm, emotional certainty, a memory with weight, texture, feeling. You remember how it felt to be there, even though the event itself dissolves under scrutiny. When challenged, the memory doesn't vanish. It defends itself, as if offended by doubt. We usually treat false memories as flaws, errors in a biological recording device. But memory was never designed to be accurate. It was designed to be useful. It prioritizes coherence over truth, survival over precision. It edits relentlessly, discarding what destabilizes the story of who you are. And sometimes, what it discards isn't fiction, it's excess. Think about how memory is formed. Experience is not stored whole, it is broken into components, sensory fragments, emotional states, contextual tags, and scattered across the brain. When you remember, you don't retrieve the past, you reconstruct it. And reconstruction is vulnerable to contamination, suggestion, emotion, expectation, but also overlap. If fragments from another version of you were to leak through, if emotional residue or decision patterns survived a transition, memory would not recognize them as foreign. It has no mechanism for that. It would do what it always does. It would integrate them, assign them a place, fabricate a context if necessary. This could explain why some memories feel older than your life, why some fears arrive fully formed, without origin, why certain places feel familiar before you've ever been there. Not comforting familiar, specific familiar, like returning to a room you rearranged long ago. There is a phenomenon known as cryptomnesia, where a forgotten memory resurfaces and is mistaken for a new thought. But that explanation assumes a single timeline, a closed system. What if the memory was not forgotten because it never belonged to this life to begin with? What if it was imported, not intentionally, not cleanly, but because continuity required something to fill a gap? Survivors of near-death events sometimes report memory distortions that don't align with trauma. They remember conversations that never occurred, knowledge they can't trace, skills that feel instinctive rather than learned. Psychology explains this as reconstruction under stress. But stress doesn't create structure. It amplifies what's already there. If influence flows across versions, memory would be the most fragile boundary. Not because it is weak, but because it is flexible. It is designed to bend, to adapt, to stitch. And stitching requires material. This reframes false memories as misattributed ones. Not invented, but misplaced. Like files dropped into the wrong folder. They don't belong, but they function. And because they function, the system keeps them. Notice how some memories feel emotionally detached, as if you are observing them rather than reliving them, while others feel too intense, as if charged with emotion you don't recognize as your own. These asymmetries suggest uneven integration. Some fragments slide in quietly, others resist. This may also explain the phenomenon of sudden certainty, moments where you know something without knowing why. You choose a route without reasoning. You avoid a situation without fear. You trust or distrust someone instantly, against evidence. We call this intuition. We praise it when it works. We ignore it when it doesn't. But intuition is just memory without a narrative. If fragments of experience from other versions of you survive as intuition, they would guide behavior without explanation. They would feel personal but not autobiographical. And because they lack context, they would be difficult to challenge. You can argue with beliefs. You cannot argue with a feeling of certainty. This could be adaptive. If another version of you encountered a danger you have not yet faced, their failure or survival could inform your choices without traumatizing you. The knowledge would arrive stripped of story, all signal, no scar. But it could also be destabilizing, Because certainty without explanation can feel like compulsion. You may feel pulled toward outcomes you don't consciously endorse, drawn to people who disrupt your life, repelled from opportunities that seem perfect on paper, as if your life is negotiating with unseen stakeholders. Memory, in this framework, becomes less like an archive and more like a consensus. The version of the past that survives is the one that best supports continuity. Truth is secondary. Function is everything. And this brings us to an uncomfortable realization. If your memories are partly assembled from fragments that didn't originate here, then your sense of identity is already a composite. You are not the author of every chapter you remember reading. Some were inserted to keep the story moving. This doesn't mean your life is fake. It means it is maintained. Think about that word, maintenance. Systems require it. Bridges, ecosystems, narratives. Without maintenance, complexity collapses. Memory is how identity is maintained across time. And if time branches, memory may be doing more work than we realize. This could explain why some people feel watched by their own past, why nostalgia feels heavier than it should, why regret arrives for choices you don't remember making. These emotions may not belong to this timeline alone. They may be shared across several, pooling into something that feels personal, but originates collectively. If that's true, then the mind is not hiding the truth out of malice. It is hiding it out of necessity. Too much awareness would fracture the self. The editing is not deception, it is insulation. But insulation leaks in dreams, in déjà vu, in encounters with mirror people, in moments when the narrative falters and something raw presses through, and each time it does, the question sharpens. If memory is protecting you from knowing too much, what would happen if it failed? What would it feel like to remember not just this life, but the ones adjacent to it? And what kind of person would you become if you did? That is the threshold we are approaching, and once crossed, the self may not remain singular. There are moments when the world feels thin, not unreal, not dreamlike, but permeable, as if the air itself has less resistance. These moments often arrive quietly, late at night, in unfamiliar places, during exhaustion, or during stillness so deep it almost hums. You are awake, alert, grounded, and yet something about the arrangement of reality feels provisional, like a set assembled just well enough to function. People describe these moments differently. Some call them dissociation, some call them spiritual, some dismiss them as fatigue. But across descriptions, the same core sensation appears, a sense that identity is loosening, that the I you normally inhabit is not gone, but slightly displaced, observing itself from a fractional distance. This is not madness. It is what happens when the narrative layer of the mind relaxes. The self you experience daily is not a constant entity. It is a process that must be actively maintained. Neuroscience shows that your sense of identity emerges from continuous prediction. The brain is always forecasting what comes next. Your thoughts, your actions, the world's response. When prediction flows smoothly, identity feels solid. When prediction falters, identity flickers. Now, imagine that prediction doesn't just falter because of internal noise, but because external inputs don't align perfectly with stored expectations. Inputs that are almost right, familiar but not exact. Like hearing your own voice spoken with a different cadence. If versions of you exist nearby in possibility space, then their influence would not arrive as foreign information. It would arrive as near misfamiliarity, inputs that almost fit the model of self, but introduce slight errors. Those errors wouldn't break the system, they would strain it, and strain produces sensation. This may be why moments of identity loosening often coincide with mirror people encounters, déjà vu, or sudden emotional shifts. The mind is attempting to reconcile overlapping signals, not from the outside world, but from adjacent configurations of itself. In physics, when multiple solutions exist to a system, constraints determine which one manifests. Identity may function similarly. The self you experience is the solution that best satisfies current constraints. Biology, environment, memory, expectation. But when constraints weaken, alternative solutions become temporarily viable. You don't become another person. You become aware that you could have been. This awareness is fleeting because the system corrects itself. It must. Sustained ambiguity would be destabilizing. So, the brain tightens narrative coherence again. You come back to yourself. but something lingers, a subtle shift in perspective, a sense that the self is not a fixed point, but a region. This idea unsettles us because it undermines a comforting assumption that there is a single central observer inside us, a captain, a witness, someone watching the thoughts go by. But neuroscience increasingly suggests that there is no such center, only coordination, multiple processes negotiating a temporary consensus we label me. If that is already true within one brain, extending it across possible lives is not as radical as it first appears. The difference is scale, not principle. This reframes identity as distributed, not scattered, but shared across attempts. Each version of you carries part of the pattern. No single one holds the whole. Most of the time, they remain unaware of each other. But awareness is not required for influence, only proximity. Proximity is not measured in meters. It is measured in similarity. The more similar two lives are, the closer their decision trees, emotional responses, values, the thinner the barrier between them. And at certain points, the barrier may be thin enough to feel through. Not clearly, not safely, but enough to disturb the illusion of separateness. This is why moments of identity thinning often feel meaningful, even when nothing happens. You don't gain information, you gain perspective. A sudden sense that the self you inhabit is not the only lens available, that existence could have resolved differently and still been coherent. Some people chase this feeling. Through meditation, psychedelics, extreme experiences, they seek the edge where the self loosens, hoping to glimpse something larger. Others avoid it instinctively, grounding themselves in routine, structure, repetition. Neither response is wrong. They are strategies for managing permeability. But consider this carefully. If identity can thin, then it can also thicken. After certain events, people report feeling more solid than before, more decisive, less conflicted, as if internal noise has quieted. These moments often follow loss, commitment, or irreversible choice. In terms of branching realities, these are points where many possibilities collapse, leaving fewer viable paths. Identity sharpens because alternatives recede. This suggests that the self is not just something you are, it is something that is constantly being selected. And selection implies exclusion. For every version of you that feels vivid and present, countless others fade into irrelevance. Not dead, just distant. Their influence weakens, their signals attenuate. But attenuation is not elimination, it is gradual loss of coherence, which raises a final, deeply uncomfortable question. If versions of you can fade, can they disappear entirely? Not die in the conventional sense, but dissolve, lose coherence, become informational noise. And if that happens, does anything remain? Or do their fragments, preferences, fears, instincts get absorbed by versions that continue? This would make identity not a birthright, but a competitive process. Not violent, not intentional, but selective. Patterns that stabilize persist. Patterns that destabilize dissolve. And what dissolves does not vanish cleanly, it leaves traces. Those traces may be what you feel as inexplicable guilt, or longing, or pressure to make this life count. Not because the universe is watching, but because you are carrying unresolved potential from versions that did not stabilize. If that idea feels heavy, notice where it lands in your body, in the chest, the stomach, the throat. These are places where meaning accumulates before language arrives. Your reaction is not logical, it is intuitive, because intuition is where these traces speak. The mind may reject this framework. It may demand proof, experiments, data. That's understandable. But proof is not always the first step toward understanding. Sometimes the first step is noticing what already exerts force on you. You are not being asked to believe this. You are being asked to notice whether it resonates. Because if identity is distributed, if memory is selective, if influence flows across versions, then the self you experience is not the beginning of the story. It is a moment in an ongoing negotiation. And that negotiation does not happen in isolation. It happens at crossroads, places where many paths briefly converge before diverging again. Places where the boundaries between lives thin more than usual. Places you may have already visited without realizing what they were. There are places in your life that feel heavier than they should. Not emotionally heavy, structurally heavy. Locations you pass through and feel an inexplicable alertness, as if something is about to happen even when nothing does. Intersections, waiting rooms, platforms, Cafes you visit only once but remember forever. Streets where your pace changes without instruction. These are not just places, they are crossroads. A crossroads is not defined by geography. It is defined by probability. It is a point where many possible futures briefly align before separating again. From the outside, it looks ordinary. From the inside, it feels charged, as if the air itself is holding its breath. Human intuition has always treated crossroads with suspicion. Ancient cultures placed gods there. Spirits, guardians, warnings. Decisions made at crossroads were believed to echo louder, carry farther, shape destiny more violently. We dismiss this as myth, but myth often survives because it encodes something real using metaphor when language is insufficient. In a branching reality, crossroads would be inevitable, points where decision density is high, where small actions disproportionately shape outcomes, where timelines that are usually separated pass closest to one another. If versions of you exist across these branches, then crossroads would be where their proximity peaks. This could explain why certain places feel crowded even when empty, why you feel watched without paranoia, why moments spent there linger in memory longer than they deserve. It's not that something happened there, it's that many things could have. Your nervous system may be sensitive to this density, not consciously, not accurately, but enough to react. Heart rate shifts. Attention sharpens. The body prepares, even if the mind doesn't know why, because the body evolved to detect significance before meaning. Think about how often life-changing events are preceded by banal decisions. Taking a different route, answering a message you almost ignored, sitting next to someone because there were no other seats. These moments don't feel important until later, but at the time, they often feel strange, slightly unreal, as if the moment is inflated. At a crossroads, identity is briefly negotiable. Multiple versions of you approach the same moment from different pasts. Most diverge again immediately, but the act of convergence itself leaves a pressure imprint, a feeling that something matters more than it logically should, that you are closer to yourself than usual, and therefore closer to contradiction. This may be why people often report mirror people appearing at transitional locations. Airports, universities, hospitals, temporary cities. These are not just social hubs, they are probability hubs. Places where lives pause, reset, redirect, where the self is already unanchored. If influence flows across versions, crossroads would amplify it. Not because they are mystical, but because they concentrate similarity. Many versions of you arrive there carrying near-identical internal states: uncertainty, anticipation, readiness. That shared state reduces resistance, makes resonance easier. This also reframes chance encounters. The feeling that meeting someone at the right time changed everything, or that missing a meeting by minutes altered the course of your life. These are not exaggerations. They are accurate descriptions of systems near bifurcation. Small inputs matter most when stability is lowest. Now consider the opposite. Places that drain you, that feel stagnant, repetitive, safe, but suffocating. These may be regions of low probability density. Few viable futures pass through them. Identity feels stable there, but narrow. The self hardens, possibility thins, comfort increases. So does quiet dissatisfaction. Crossroads are uncomfortable because they threaten that stability. They remind the system that it is contingent, that it could have resolved differently, and still can. This is why people often avoid crossroads instinctively. They delay decisions, miss trains, stay too long in familiar situations. It's not laziness, it's self-preservation. The mind resists being pulled into regions where identity must renegotiate itself. But avoidance has a cost. Because if crossroads are where influence and alignment occur, then avoiding them also means avoiding updates. Avoiding convergence with versions of yourself that have adapted in ways you haven't yet. Avoiding information that could stabilize your trajectory long-term. This creates a paradox. Growth requires instability, but instability threatens coherence. So the mind oscillates. It approaches, retreats, tests the edge. Some people live almost entirely at crossroads. Constant change, constant reinvention. Their identity is fluid but fragile. Others build fortresses of routine. Their identity is solid but brittle. Neither extreme is sustainable forever. The healthiest systems oscillate deliberately. They choose when to enter regions of high probability density and when to consolidate. They don't confuse comfort with truth or instability with meaning. If versions of you exist across many branches, then crossroads are not just moments of choice. They are moments of communication, not explicit, not verbal, but structural. Information flows where similarity is highest. This may explain why some decisions feel guided without instruction, why you know what to do without knowing why hesitation vanishes suddenly, or why dread appears out of nowhere. These are not commands, they are pressures, gradients in possibility space. You are not being told what to choose. You are being shown which choices are stable, and which ones are not. This does not remove freedom, it contextualizes it. You are still the one who steps forward, but the ground is not neutral, it slopes, and you feel that slope long before you understand it. The unsettling implication is this: if crossroads are where versions of you converge, then they are also where versions of you diverge permanently. Decisions made there do not just shape your future, they isolate you from others. Some paths bring you closer to coherence, others push you into solitude. That solitude may feel like independence, or like alienation, or like purpose. Often it feels like all three. And once a certain threshold is crossed, returning becomes unlikely. Not impossible, but improbable. The versions of you that would have returned lose alignment. Their signals fade. Their influence weakens. This is how lives become distinct, not by choice alone, but by cumulative divergence. As we move toward the final stretch of this exploration, one question remains unresolved. If some versions of you stabilize and others fade, is it possible that one version becomes aware of the process itself? A version that notices the patterns, that recognizes the echoes, that remembers more than it should. And if such a version exists, what role does it play? That is where this story is heading next. There is a thought that arrives late, once you've followed this thread far enough. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It waits until the idea of many versions of you no longer feels abstract, but structural. And then it asks something that feels dangerous to hold for too long. If multiple versions of you exist, why do you feel like the one who is asking these questions? Why this version? Why this awareness? Across all possible lives, across all the near identical paths, why does consciousness seem to collect here, in this particular strand, noticing the pattern instead of dissolving into it? This question has haunted philosophy for centuries in different forms. Why this body? Why this moment? Why this perspective? We usually answer it with randomness or fate or dismiss it entirely, but in a branching reality, the question sharpens. Awareness itself becomes suspect. Imagine that among all versions of you, there are differences not just in choices, but in coherence. Some lives stabilize, others fragment. Some identities hold together under pressure, others disperse. In complex systems, coherence is not evenly distributed. It clusters, it accumulates. It prefers certain configurations over others. If consciousness is a process that requires coherence to persist, then awareness would naturally concentrate in versions of you that maintain it best. Not morally best, not happiest, but structurally stable, capable of integrating contradiction without collapsing. This would mean something unsettling, that you are not randomly conscious. You are conscious because this version of you holds together. The versions that don't experience confusion. They don't experience darkness. They don't experience anything at all. They dissolve into noise. Their fragments, habits, instincts, emotional residues don't vanish. They are absorbed by versions that remain coherent enough to carry them. This is not reincarnation. There is no clean cycle, no reset. It is closer to consolidation, like data being merged when redundant processes shut down, information preserved, perspective lost. If that's true, then consciousness is not spread evenly across the multiverse. It funnels, it concentrates, it selects. And selection produces hierarchy, not of value, but of awareness. This could explain why some people feel like observers of their own lives, why they feel slightly removed, analytical, reflective, as if watching a process unfold rather than being fully immersed in it. They are not detached because they are disengaged. They are detached because they are integrating more than one signal. They are carrying weight. This also reframes the feeling of being old inside, not mature, not wise. Old. As if you've been here before, not in this life, but across attempts, across variations. As if you are tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. That tiredness may not come from suffering. It may come from accumulation. If fragments from less stable versions of you are absorbed, then awareness carries the burden of unresolved tendencies, unfinished loops, abandoned paths, emotional potentials that never found expression. These do not arrive as memories. They arrive as pressure. Pressure to make this life matter. Pressure to choose carefully. Pressure to notice. This pressure can feel like anxiety or purpose depending on how it's interpreted. It can feel like dread or responsibility. Many people oscillate between the two. They sense that something is at stake, but can't articulate what. If one version of you becomes especially coherent, able to hold contradiction, uncertainty, and self-awareness without fracturing, it may become a kind of attractor. Other versions drift toward it, not physically, but informationally. Their unresolved patterns seek resolution in the version that can sustain them. This version becomes heavier, more aware, more burdened, more alone, because awareness is isolating when it accumulates. This could explain why people who are deeply introspective often feel alienated. Not superior, not special, just separate. As if they are slightly out of sync with the world's tempo, watching rather than dancing, listening for something others don't hear. It could also explain why awareness often brings sadness, not because life is bleak, but because awareness includes what did not happen, what could not be carried forward, the selves that did not cohere strongly enough to remain experiential. You don't mourn them consciously, you feel them as absence, as a hollow note beneath your choices, as a quiet insistence that time is limited. Even if subjectively, continuity always finds a way forward. This is where the idea becomes truly uncomfortable. If awareness concentrates, then some version of you may remember more than others. Not explicitly, not in images, but structurally. They may sense the shape of the process. They may notice patterns others dismiss. They may feel déjà vu, not as surprise, but as confirmation. This version would not be omniscient, but it would be suspicious, curious, unable to fully relax into the illusion of singularity. If you are watching this, listening to this, following this line of thought, not with dismissal, but with recognition, ask yourself something honestly. Is this the first time you've encountered these ideas? Or does it feel like something you've circled before? Because ideas, like lives, also branch. And some versions of you may have already walked this conceptual path, only to turn away at the last moment, to choose comfort over inquiry, stability over uncertainty. This version didn't. This version followed the thread. That choice alone doesn't make you special, but it does make you different. And difference over time accumulates. As we approach the final movement of this exploration, the focus shifts, away from theory, away from possibility, toward consequence. If awareness concentrates, if identity is distributed, if memory edits and influence leaks, then the question is no longer whether you've met other versions of yourself. The question is whether this version, the one listening right now, has a role to play, whether awareness is passive or whether it carries responsibility, and if it does, what happens when you ignore it? That is where this journey ends, and where the meaning, if there is one, finally reveals itself. There is a quiet relief in reaching the end of a long thought, not because it resolves everything, but because it allows the mind to rest inside a shape. For most of this journey, we've been circling questions about identity, memory, influence, survival, never landing fully on any one answer. That was intentional, because the truth, if there is one, does not arrive as a conclusion. It arrives as a stance. If other versions of you exist, then existence is not a straight narrative. It is a field of attempts, of variations, of near misses and partial successes. And you are not standing outside this field, observing it like a diagram. You are standing inside it, contributing to its shape simply by continuing. This reframes what it means to live a life. Your choices are no longer just personal preferences or moral statements. They are stabilizing forces. Each decision you make, what you pursue, what you avoid, what you nurture, what you abandon, does more than affect your future. It reinforces one configuration of the self over countless others. It strengthens some patterns and allows others to fade. In that sense, you are not merely living your life. You are selecting which version of you persists. This does not make every decision cosmic. It does not burden every moment with existential weight. Most choices are small, local, reversible. But over time, patterns emerge, and patterns determine coherence. Coherence is what allows experience to continue smoothly. It is what allows meaning to accumulate instead of scatter. It is what allows awareness to deepen instead of fragment. And coherence is fragile. It does not survive constant contradiction. It requires alignment, not perfection, but direction. If you have ever felt that certain choices cost you something intangible but important, this may be why. Not because you chose wrong in a moral sense, but because you chose against coherence, against the version of you that was most able to carry the weight of existence forward without splintering. This does not mean there is only one correct path. There are many stable configurations, many ways a life can hold together. But not all paths are equally viable for every version of you. Some paths resonate with who you are becoming, others create internal friction that never fully resolves. This is where responsibility quietly enters the picture, not responsibility imposed from outside, not duty, not guilt, but responsibility as responsiveness. The ability to feel when something aligns and when it doesn't. The willingness to listen to that signal without mystifying it or dismissing it. If other versions of you exist, they do not judge you. They do not watch you. They do not wait. Most of them dissolve without ever knowing they existed. Their only trace is what they leave behind. Pressure, intuition, unfinished momentum. You carry that momentum whether you want to or not. The question is, what you do with it. You can spend your life trying to numb it, distract yourself, reduce awareness until existence feels lighter. Many people do. It works for a while. Or you can let awareness sharpen, not into anxiety but into clarity, into a quieter, steadier way of moving through the world. Awareness does not demand grand gestures. It does not require you to chase meaning or prove anything. Often it asks for the opposite: simplicity, honesty, consistency. The courage to live in a way that does not require constant self-justification. If this version of you has become more aware, it is not because you are meant to save anything. It is because you are capable of integration, of holding complexity without needing it to resolve into fantasy or despair. That capacity matters, because in a reality that branches endlessly, coherence is rare, and what is rare becomes valuable, not in a cosmic sense, but in a functional one. Coherent systems persist. Fragmented ones fade. This is not a threat. It is not a prophecy. It is an observation. And it brings us back to the question that began this journey. Have you met other versions of yourself? Perhaps you have. In strangers who felt too familiar, in moments that felt rehearsed, in instincts that arrived without explanation, in grief you couldn't trace, in pressure that felt older than your life. But the more important question is this: what kind of version are you becoming now? Because this version, the one listening, reflecting, noticing, is not guaranteed. It is sustained moment by moment through choices that either align or fracture. And while subjectively, experience always seems to continue, its quality does not remain constant. You do not need to fear disappearing, but you may want to care about coherence. Not to be perfect, not to be certain, but to be internally consistent enough that awareness can rest inside you without strain. If there are many versions of you, then this one is not alone, but it is the one that is here. And that, quietly, is enough reason to take it seriously. The universe does not ask you to understand it. It does not ask you to believe in hidden structures or parallel lives. It asks only that you inhabit this one honestly, because honesty stabilizes, attention integrates, and coherence endures. And if somewhere in the vast space of possibility, other versions of you are fading, then let this one be the place where the story holds.